This is how to protect your kids' inheritance from their divorce. If your kids go through a divorce, half of their inheritance could be lost to the divorce settlement. The reason being is that when you pass assets down to them in their personal name, they're accessible to the divorce settlement. And even if you tell them to keep those assets separate, they're typically using marital funds to take care of that property, which makes it marital property and subject to being split in a divorce settlement. So this video is going to tell you how to protect your kids' inheritance so you keep the wealth inside of your family and do not lose it to their ex-spouse. Most parents are going to assume that when you give an inheritance down to your kid, it only goes to your kids. So the problem is going to be that when you put assets inside of joint accounts, you jointly title it, etc., those assets become marital property and they're subject to being split in a divorce settlement, which means that their ex-spouse is going to take half of the assets that you pass down to your kids and that you worked your entire life for. So let's make sure that your kids are not going to lose their inheritance to a divorce settlement if that ever comes up. The most effective way to leave your inheritance down to your kids so it's protected from a divorce settlement is going to be using a trust. The reason being is that when you put the assets inside of a trust and you pass away, you're keeping those assets inside the trust. You're not actually distributing those assets out to your kids and giving it to them in their personal name or risking them using marital funds to take care of those assets. So the benefit of this is that the assets will not be in your kid's name. Your kids will still get to use those assets for things like emergencies, education, healthcare, their home, business, etc. And the divorce courts cannot divide it up because your kids never legally owned it. The trust owned those assets. So these are the key features of a trust to make sure that they are divorce proof. So the trust needs to be set up the correct way so that it actually gives your assets asset protection from your kid's divorce. The first one's going to be a spendthrift clause. This keeps your kids from being able to use the assets inside the trust as collateral for anything related to their lives, which means that creditors and ex-spouses cannot access the assets inside the trust because your kids cannot give those assets away and no one can actually take them by force. Another feature is going to be distributions at the trustee's discretion. Instead of giving your kids full control over the assets inside the trust and when they should take over the distributions of them, you let the trustee decide when those distributions should happen. That way the courts know that the kids are not in control of those distributions, the trustee is in control of them. You'll want separate property language, so you want to make sure that the trust clearly states that the assets inside the trust are separate property, not marital property, in the event that your kids do go through a divorce. And you also do not want to give required distributions, so you don't want to include things that say like annual distributions, monthly distributions, etc. The reason being is that required distributions become a target in a divorce settlement and the courts can garnish distributions that you have on a reoccurring basis. So who should be the trustee of your trust when you're trying to protect your assets from your kids' divorce? You have three main options here. The first one is going to be your kids. While it's the easiest option, is the most risky because if your kids are in control of their own distributions, the courts could decide that they want to capture some of the inheritance that's being distributed out to them for that divorce settlement. The second one is going to be another family member. So this one gives you a little bit more protection because there's more separation. But you have to make sure that you're choosing a responsible individual who can actually manage the assets inside the trust. If they can't manage their own finances, they're not going to be able to manage the assets inside the trust on behalf of your kids. So make sure you're choosing someone who is financially responsible. The third one's going to be a professional trustee. This would be someone like a lawyer who is experienced in managing assets inside of a trust, distributing them out to the beneficiaries. Now this one's going to be the maximum protection because they are a neutral third party and they have the experience in managing and distributing assets out of a trust. Now most people are going to choose a family member as a trustee for their primary option, and then some people will choose a professional like a lawyer to manage them. And you might be thinking, gosh, can't I just give it to my kids and tell them to keep the assets separate? Yes, but it's a little bit more risky. So let's say that you pass the property down to your kid and you tell them to keep the property in their name only. Now it's pretty common for spouses to set up joint tenants' rights to survivorship or some form of co-ownership of property. And the problem is going to be no one is expecting to get a divorce. They may decide like, hey, we're happily married. We're not going to get a divorce. Let's just put both of our names on the title. That way, if one of us passes away, the property will avoid the probate process and directly go down to the surviving spouse. Makes sense, right? But the problem is going to be when you have joint ownership of that property, the courts are going to decide that now it's splittable in the divorce settlement. The other problem is going to be if you give them money, and even if they keep it inside of a separate account, if they put even $1 from a joint bank account into that separate account, it then becomes marital property because they used marital funds to contribute to that bank account. Now, if you are going to cheap out and go this route and not use the trust to fully separate these assets and this money from your kids, then you want to make sure that your kids are very responsible, very thorough, and very organized on how they are managing their assets and their finances. Because if they mess anything up, even slightly, those assets will get split up in the divorce settlement. Now, obviously, estate planning planning is easy to put off, most people are going to wait to set this up. You should not wait on this, because if you pass away with those assets in your personal name, they will get distributed out to your kids and they will be accessible to that divorce settlement. So if you want to protect those assets from your kid's ex-spouse, make sure that you are setting up the asset protection correctly so that their ex-spouse cannot take the assets you spent your entire life building, so you can pass down to your family and keep it inside of that family. Bonus tip here: so you may be worried about creditors and lawsuits. Let's say your kids get into a car accident and they severely injure someone and they sue your kids, or they lose their job and they're unable to find another one and they foreclose on the properties and creditors are coming after them. If you have passed your assets down to your kids and those assets are in their personal name and they have any of those liabilities coming after them, those liabilities are able to access the assets that you passed down to them in that inheritance. Now, when you put the assets inside of a trust and then you pass away and you keep those assets inside the trust, those liabilities are unable to come after the assets inside of that trust because you have kept those assets fully separated from your kids. They are not in your kids' name. That way, any lawsuits or creditors coming after your kids cannot come after the assets inside of the trust. So your assets you're trying to pass down to your kids will have asset protection from divorce settlements, lawsuits, and creditors coming after your kids. If you want to make sure that the inheritance you're passing down to your kids has asset protection from divorce settlements, lawsuits, or creditors coming after your kids, click link in the bio, fill out the form, and schedule a time to talk to some of our team.